Hello and welcome to A Sunny Book Nook. Today I'm going to be wrapping up all the books that I read in the month of July. I read 27 books. Actually, 28 books technically, if we consider a reread that I did for a book club situation that I helped host. But let's just get into it. I'm going to be starting off with the first book that I read in the month and going all the way through till the last book that I read in this month. So chronologically, right? But before I get into that, let's get into some stats. So I read 1 2-star book, 11 3-star books, 9 4-star books, and 6 5-star books. So generally a pretty good reading month, and I got to pretty much all the books that were on my TBR. So that's really exciting, and I'm proud of myself for that. I don't know in terms of comparing to past months how good this reading month was, but I'm just gonna assume that 27, 28, sorry, I cannot remember numbers for the life of me. 28 books is pretty good, I think. So the first book that I read in the month of July was Long Way Down by Jason Reynolds. This book was a pretty short read, talking about the cycle of violence. The whole concept is that this boy's brother gets shot, and in the 60-second elevator ride that the brother is riding down in an elevator trying to go take revenge on the person who killed his brother. And on this elevator ride, he gets in contact with and speaks to different people in his life, and a lot is revealed to him. So I rated this book 3 stars. I thought that the storytelling was definitely really impactful and the message was clear, but it just didn't really connect with me, writing at least, and in any particular way that was too memorable to me. I know a lot of people love this book, so I'm probably just an outlier on this end, but I don't know. I thought that this book was good, but not great, at least for my own personal reading experience. Next up, I read An Enchantment of Ravens by Margaret Rogerson. I thought this book was so great, it made my heart flutter and explode with joy. It's kind of like your typical fairy fantasy romance story with a blonde girl and a dark and handsome prince fairy dude. The world building I thought was pretty good, not too heavy-handed, not too sparse. The characterization and the romance was also just cute and pretty standard, but it definitely made me feel a lot of things, and I did not expect for a heterosexual white fairy romance to get me the way that this book did, which is why I rated it 4 stars. I definitely want to check out Margaret Rogerson's other book, but I know that her other book is longer than An Enchantment of Ravens, which I really appreciated for both being not a series, a standalone fantasy book, which is pretty rare, and I also appreciate for being pretty short, which I also appreciate in especially fantasy novels. So the next book that I read was Clara by Garth Nix. This is the 4th book in his Abhorsen series. I've rated pretty much every book in the series 3 stars, because it is a 3-star series for me. It's a comfortable fantasy world with different characters to follow in each book, with different conflicts and plot structures. But for each book on its own, it's not particularly spectacular in any way. And it goes for this one as well. The next book that I read was You Should See Me in a Crown by Leah Johnson. I thought this was really cute, a really special and sapphic and diverse young adult novel. I just thought it was really solid. Nothing too spectacular in my eyes, but I felt like it dealt with characters and friend groups and relationships that felt like your typical young adult novel, but not particularly cheesy or overwrought, just good. The romance was cute, the friendships were cute, and the various conflicts that arise were pretty realistic, as is the dissection of how racism operates in predominantly white high schools. I gave this book 3 stars. The next book that I read in the month of July was Slay by Brittany Morris. I thought that this book was phenomenal. I thought that the world building for the video game that this book is centered around was just wonderful. Like, it was so good, and I thought that the relationships and the characterization and the discussion around inclusion versus exclusion and safe spaces for Black people and online gaming, and just like girl gamers, like, wow, we love to see it. I thought this book was really great, and I rated it 5 stars. Highly recommend. This is like top tier young adult fiction, I think, and it jumps between perspectives, which I didn't really expect, but all of the perspectives I thought were really insightful and touched on realistic things and realistic happenings of people globally, really, regarding race and like the internet. The next book that I read was Fierce Femmes and Notorious Liars by Kat Chang Tong. This book was phenomenal. It had a magical realism memoir quality to it, which is actually a pretty common theme for some of the books I'm talking about this month, which is interesting. But this book follows this Asian trans girl in her coming of age and discovering her home and finding community and meeting different people in different walks of life and other trans girls and people who mentor her or are in different convoluted relationships with her. The writing was just so beautiful, so imaginative, so empathetic, and so full of heart, and it made me cry, definitely. And I thought that it was really gritty and raw, but also whimsical. I highly recommend this book. I rated it 4 stars, and I didn't rate it 5 stars mostly because I thought that some of the writing was a little bit overwrought, a little bit not to my taste, but I thought that the general storytelling and the general characterization and the implementation and use of magic throughout the story was so good. The next book that I read was Laguardia by Mediocre. This is a graphic novel, and Deidre from Shade Tree Reads was talking about it, which is why I picked it up, and she said that I would probably like it, and I did. I rated it 4 stars. It's set in the science fiction future where aliens are part of global politics now. And they are also the target of a lot of xenophobia, and we're following this couple kind of and her family, and she's pregnant and she's trying to get through TSA and the airports, but they have huge restrictions on alien species present, and I thought that it was really interesting and imaginative, and the art was pretty cool, pretty standard, like comic style that incorporated the alien element of the story. Like, I thought that the plant alien characters and species were really cool to look at and just to think about existing. So yeah, I thought this was really conceptually well done and artistically well delivered. The next book that I read was All Boys Aren't Blue by George M. Johnson. This book is so good, as you may already know. I rated it 5 stars. I thought that this memoir did some really beautiful storytelling. Highly recommend. If you haven't read it already, definitely check it out. The next book that I read was Black is the Body: Stories from My Grandmother's Time, My Mother's Time, and Mine by Emily Bernard. I rated this book 4 stars. I thought that the discussions of motherhood and race and family and academia and adoption. This is another kind of memoir collection of essay nonfiction book, and I definitely think that if you liked All Boys Aren't Blue, or if you like reading memoirs or kind of essays reflecting on things like race and motherhood and particularly adoption, you should definitely check this one out because she speaks on all of those things really eloquently. The next book that I read was Real Life by Brandon Taylor. I really enjoyed this book. I thought that it explored the struggle of being a graduate student and being a gay person of color and just being a person of color, and specifically a Black person in like an all-white kind of academic space, and the fraught relationships and the difference between your expectations and like the reality of going to grad school or becoming an adult, what real life actually looks like and how miserable it can be. And I thought that this was a really interesting slice of life, heart-wrenching, this storytelling that was just very, very real, as the title would, imply. So definitely recommend this book. I rated it 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. The next book that I read was a nonfiction book called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney. This book was phenomenal, and I wish everyone would read it, but particularly people who read fiction about or set in Africa or about the African diaspora. I think that this book does a really, really good job at breaking down the connections between colonialism, white supremacy, capitalism, imperialism, and how they live on today. Even though this was written, in like the 70s? I really don't remember. But this book kind of analyzes these historical things and debunks a lot of myths and European narratives about Africa in a really comprehensive, cohesive, and well-argued way with a lot of thorough research. I really, really enjoyed this book. I thought it was incredibly informative, and I really want to get a physical copy of it because I listened to it on audiobook. I want to go through it, reread it, annotate it. The next book that I read was a middle grade horror novel called Small Spaces by Catherine Arent. I've heard good things about this book, and it didn't disappoint necessarily, but I didn't really like it as much as I wanted to. I rated it 3 stars. I thought that it was good. I thought the storytelling was really interesting, but I don't know. I have a disconnection with a lot of middle grade, I feel like, because I think that the characterization and the voice is kind of juvenile. I mean, granted, it is obviously written for, like, children, and people who read middle grade, and I'm not really either of those audiences. That probably colors my interpretation and reading of this book a lot. But regardless, the storytelling and the plot and the world building and the horror element of it was pretty well done. The next book that I read was Hood Feminism, Notes from the Women That a Movement Forgot by Mickey Kendall. I thought this was a really good, modern, and comprehensive breakdown of the failings of white feminism and what feminism itself doesn't really include in the mainstream mind, but that feminism should include, such as welfare, income inequality, environmental racism, things that impact women disproportionately, but are not really talked about because they don't impact white women or middle-class white women. And yeah, I thought it was pretty good. I thought that it was a really solid piece of nonfiction, a solid piece of modern nonfiction, and it definitely is a really good introduction to Black feminist thought and theory. So I would recommend people who don't really read that much nonfiction or who are just looking to learn more about intersectional feminism to look into this book. I rated it 4 stars. The next book that I read was I Can Make This Promise by Christine Day. This was a really cute novel, but again, it's another middle grade, so I felt that disconnect again. And it's basically following this Native American girl whose mom was adopted, so feels that she's kind of disconnected from her heritage and her background. It's about her kind of discovering and rediscovering her identity through connecting with family and her past, and it also goes into a little bit the forced family separation that the US government did and has done and continues to do of Indigenous families. So I thought that this is a really good introduction to children and to young readers about this issue and fleshing out the discovery of one's own identity. And I thought that this book was really tender and warm, and it felt like a cute family story that had really important themes of friendship and figuring out your identity, as I said before, all kind of meshed in together. So I rated this book 3 stars, and I would recommend to anyone who wants to read more middle grade, I guess, or who is a middle grade reader and is looking for a good book. The next book that I read was Orlando by Virginia Woolf. I gave this book 3 stars, mostly because I didn't really get what was going on, because I wasn't reading with that much intention, I feel like. So that's kind of my fault, but I don't know. This is a seminal piece of gay fiction. I wanted to figure out what Virginia Woolf was all about, and I think I got a little taste of it here, but I definitely need to dig deeper into her work to understand what is going on. So I read this book 3 stars, but again, mostly because I'm a little bit dumb in the head and I wasn't reading that critically or with that much focus or intensity. If I reread this for a class or something, I'm sure I would have much more insights and takeaways, but alas. The next book that I read was the most disappointing read because it was my only 2-star read, and that was Good Omens by Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman. I don't understand why so many people love this. I mean, I kind of get why it's a cult classic and like favorite, I guess, of so many people, but I don't know. I just found that a lot of the racism in it was really off-putting. It really jolted me out of the story, and also the story itself. I felt like it wanted to be quirky and funny and cool and big-brained, but really it was just kind of, like I said, racist and a little bit small-minded, I think. So I didn't really enjoy this book. Wouldn't recommend. I don't know why so many people enjoy it. The next book that I read is a very controversial 5-star read that I said that I will make a review video on, but I need to reread this book first in order to, like, make my points. And that is Docile by K.M. Spara. I thought this book was so engrossing, and I thought it was so good. I think that it did a good job at doing what it set out to do, which was criticizing and critiquing capitalism and its impact on our relationships to each other and our dependency to the people who employ us, and also the way that romantic and sexual relationships are so deeply impacted by capitalism. I also thought that the imagination and the world building of this world is really just taking the most extreme levels of capitalist exploitation and capitalist isolation from our emotions and that abuse of the erotic, as Audre Lorde would say, to the fullest extent and to its most extreme extent. It takes that corporate, techno-fascist, medical fascist world building and shows us the worst possible thing and what ends up happening during in a relationship that is fully one-sided in power, and how grooming and how being in that abusive relationship can totally wipe your own identity and your own perception of yourself as an entity removed from that person. How capitalism and interpersonal relationships interact can then lead to the harm of some people. And I just thought that they did a really good job of doing that. I feel like people who don't like it on the basis of it being kind of like race blind in a way, or not criticizing the racial element of how capitalism plays out into this book, I think that's a fair criticism. But I also think that because the author is white, presumably, they never had the range to be able to write about that anyway. And there are so many other great fantasy dystopian books from Black authors and authors of color that criticize racial capitalism. But I thought that the goal that this book set out to do of criticizing capitalism's impact on interpersonal relationships on a romantic, sexual, and family level was really good. And I thought that the plot development was really well done. The characterization and the use of characterization was also well done. The display of people with money and power and media have so much extensive control over how the entire world operates. It was just so good, I think. Not that like it was enjoyable to read necessarily, but it made me feel a lot of emotions and it made me think a lot, and it was saying a lot of things and making a lot of commentary. And I wish that people who didn't like this book, I wonder if it's because they like missed some of that criticism. I don't know, maybe the kind of sexual relationship or romantic relationship that is described throughout this book was off-putting for people, which makes sense. But I don't think that the book was ultimately celebrating the coercion that goes on in this book, and it is critical of that unequivocally. I don't know if that's how you say the word. But anyway, yeah, I've already talked about this book for too long, but yeah, once I reread this book and mark it up and annotate it and everything and pick out the things that really stuck out to me the second time around, I definitely will make a review video of this, but ultimately, I loved this book a lot, and it's gonna stay in my mind and my heart for a while. So the next book that I read was Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer. This was for the challenge for, actually, if you've already seen my Reading Rush TBR video, you'll know, but go watch that video if you haven't already. I thought this book was not as good as the movie, and I rated it 3 stars. I thought that the writing was kind of dry, and I thought that I just didn't really connect with this, but maybe that's because I was tapped out of reading it, or maybe because, like, my understanding of the movie and my memories of how the movie worked. Okay, sorry for the lighting change and the abrupt shift in the clips and whatever, but my camera just shut off randomly and cut me off, which was really rude of it to do. What I was saying about Annihilation was that it really taught me that I cannot read a book after I watch the movie because my brain cannot compute. It does not associate these two separate entities of media, and it clashes in my brain. So anyway, that's why I rated it 3 stars. It's more of the fact that I am a little bit stupid and unable to like hold these two things at once than it is something that has to do with the actual quality of the writing of the book. But even that being said, I thought that the writing was a little bit dry, and I don't know if I'm going to keep reading any Vandermeer novels, which is unfortunate because Vandermeer is one of Jessie at Sunbeam's I think her name is Jess's favorite authors, and I really love her channel and her book recommendations and stuff, so that's unfortunate. Oh, also, another thing about the fact that these are 2 different video clips, I forgot to put on my eyebrows for the first half of this video, so I'm sorry you had to witness that. Oh, also I'm realizing that I forgot to put my lipstick on again after I ate, so let me go do that. So anyway, now that that is all resolved, let's move on to the next book that I read in the month of July, which was The Arithmetist by Brandon Sanderson. I absolutely adored this book. I thought that the magic system, the world building, the character development, the relationships were all just so... It was all the best parts of young adult fantasy that was all just kind of mushed together. But that being said, the reason why I rated it 4 stars as opposed to 5 stars was because some of the elements of the storytelling felt kind of archetypical to the genre, but that doesn't take away from how memorable the magic system and characters were. So I just really enjoyed this book, and it's really sad to me that Sanderson didn't continue the series, and like, this was published in 2013 and the second book hasn't even come out yet, so Sanderson, please just write the next books. Anyway, moving on from that, the next book that I read was Such a Fun Age by Kylie Reed. I also talk about this one in my Books That White Women Should Read video that I put up recently, and I really enjoyed this book. I thought that it totally eviscerated white female identity and also just criticized how white liberals use Black women to feel woke and like, you know, in this really tokenizing and racist way. But it also gave us this main character that was this millennial who didn't really know what she was doing and like had no particular direction in life. And she was still so like full of heart and a relatable character in her mediocrity, in that she wasn't too into any particular thing. I think that's pretty relatable for a lot of people. And yeah, so I rated this book 3 stars. So I thought that the storytelling was good, I thought the writing was really great, and the characterizations were good as well. And I thought that the message the story was telling was also phenomenal. However, I found myself cringing so much while reading this book because I just was so angry at the characters, and I was so frustrated by so much of what was going on and what these characters were thinking and saying, and it just made for a somewhat miserable reading experience at some points. Still a good book, though. The next book that I read is another magical realism memoir, and that was In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. This is a memoir talking about an abusive FF relationship, and it was really well written, metaphorical, and just so tender and honest. And I thought that the writing was pretty flowery, which isn't exactly my vibes, which is why even though the storytelling was objectively amazing and this book is really, really good, I rated this book 4 stars. The next book that I read was Fearing the Black Body, which was on my Reading Rush TBR, and this book was so, so, so good. Especially the first and last chapters. I think that anyone who doesn't know that racism and fat phobia are linked, or who think that fat people are just like unhealthy or whatever, should definitely read this book, because it really breaks down the constructed mythology of the attractive and healthy female body in particular. It also talks about men and body size and fatness, and specifically it shows how the slender ideal is a constructed racist corporate construct and not actually a medical fact or reality, and rather it is rooted in fundamentally like colonialism and racism. And I thought that this read was so good, so necessary, and I rated it 5 stars. The next book that I read was Black Girl Unlimited by Echo Brown, and this was another magical realism memoir. I definitely cried while reading this, and it basically follows a wizard, like a girl wizard in Cleveland, and her issues with her family and her environment and her school environment and her identity. I thought that it was such raw, gritty storytelling that was still so beautiful and real and young. I thought that the events that Echo Brown describes going through in this book are just so traumatic to even witness as a third person perspective, but just to know that this is what the author had basically went through and then had still like overcome all odds. It was just really inspiring and really hopeful at the end of the day. And I thought that this was a really beautiful use of magical realism and these fantastical elements as well, because the parallels between the things that you go through because you're a wizard and also just the trauma and the mental health issues of yourself and everyone in your life. I thought that those connections and those parallels were just so well wrought, and I think that all young adults should read this book. I rated it 5 stars. I thought it was so, so, so good. And plus this cover, it's beautiful. Like, I'm obsessed with it. The next book that I read was The Black Flamingo by Dean Atta. I gave this book 3 stars, which is kind of unpopular because a lot of people who read this absolutely loved this, like said it was a 5-star read. But for me, I didn't really connect with the poetry and the storytelling as much. I felt that it was a little bit more juvenile than I expected, and I just wanted more from it that I didn't really get. I thought that it only touched on kind of surface level topics, but again, 3 stars is not a bad rating for me, at least. I still really enjoyed my reading of this, and it was a really quick read because it's like, you know, free verse. I enjoyed it, but not to the extent that I've enjoyed other poetry stories, such as The Poet X. So yeah, sorry about that unpopular opinion. But the next book that I read was The Falling in Love Montage by Ciara Smith. I really enjoyed this, but also I thought that the moral of the story was kind of like slammed over our heads a little bit. But I thought that as a FF romance, this was really good, and as a young adult story, really good. It did that cutesy rom-com thing, and it was a little bit insta-love, but it's okay. But it also dealt with difficult issues, such as dealing with a member of a family who is really sick, and the family dynamics and the relationships and the conflicts that are in this book and the coming-of-age elements were all pretty realistic, I felt. But the main issue I had with it was that I felt like the message of the story was very much shown as opposed to told to us as the readers. So yeah, 3 stars again is still good, and I would still recommend this book if you're looking for a young adult female romance. Also, it's set in Ireland, which I love a book that's set in Ireland. So the next book that I read was These Ghosts Are Family by Maisie Card, which is an intergenerational story set in Jamaica and New York City about these family members who might not know they're related to each other, and we also get the perspectives of ghosts. So there's like magical realism, folklore elements in here as well. It spans across the 60s till the early 2010s, and I thought that the storytelling was very, very intricate and well done. But I rated it 3 stars because even though I recognize it as an objectively good piece of literature, I didn't quite connect with the story, and I also found that none of the characters were particularly likable, and it was also really sad. I mean, of course, the topics that were being discussed were, of course, really sad, but it was to the point where I would be reading it and I'm like, oh my god, this is so depressing, and I didn't feel like picking it up again. I don't know. But it was a really sad book, but I thought that it really dived into the question of intergenerational trauma and women and class within Jamaica and how that gets translated in the diaspora and the kind of immigration narrative, and also these kind of complicated family relationships. And I thought that it also interrogated whiteness and the history of whiteness in this really interesting way. The story was really compelling, and it also had this interesting framing device where sometimes it'd be stories within stories, and sometimes because there was no one singular narrator, all of the narrations were so clearly colored by the experiences of whomever was telling it, and it also had elements of that like unreliable narrator style of storytelling, which was all really wonderful to see played out because the storytelling was, again, very intricate and very well done. So I definitely would recommend this book. It just wasn't necessarily for me in every way. And the last book, at least chronologically, that I read in the month of July was The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. I rated this book 4 stars. I thought it was phenomenal. I thought that it interrogated Christianity as this homogenous kind of structural force in society in this really critical and necessary way. So I think that anyone who grew up Christian or who is Christian should definitely read this book. And I also thought that his reflections on meeting Elijah Muhammad and his understandings of the Nation of Islam, and then on a more zoomed out level, how humanity and America works and how race within America functions and his own positionality within that, I thought that it was beautifully done, and it really was very expansive in its ideas, and I thought that it touched on these universal humanity things that lots of authors try to get at, but Baldwin really did get at. The reason why I didn't give it 5 stars is that I didn't really connect with it the same way that I connected with some other nonfiction. Just to be a little more critical and honest about my experiences with reading this book, it was more of a 4-star read for me. And finally, I didn't know where to put this book in terms of my chronological order. I reread this book for a book club this book discussion thing I was helping lead. Anyway, it was Sister Outsider by Audre Lorde, and this is like a seminal Black feminist text, and all of the essays inside this are so good. I thought that it interrogated Black womanhood, white womanhood, Blackness, and being a lesbian, identity in that way, and also there's the uses of the erotic and the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, both of which are, I think, really necessary reads, especially for people who consider themselves feminists. And also my favorite essay from this book is the last one, which is called Grenada Revisited. I think that chapter is so powerful and links to so many things that continue to ripple into today. I mean, all of the essays in here are applicable in many ways to modern life and contemporary analysis of how the world works and how oppression functions, but I think this is definitely a necessary read for anyone who wants to understand more about the intersection between the fight for racial justice and feminism. So yeah, definitely read this book if you haven't already. This is definitely one that can reshape your entire worldview and radicalize you and politicize you, as I know it has done for a lot of my friends and my peers. Those are all the books that I read in the month of July. Again, it was a pretty solid reading month, and let me know if any of these books are things that you would be interested in reading. Thank you so much for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, all that stupid bullshit, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!